Greetings and salutations, young true believers. So, we finished up chapter 10, chapter 11, inductive reasoning. And a large part of chapter 11 is dedicated to arguments from analogy. You are going to encounter arguments from analogy in diverse fields. You will find them in law. As a matter of fact, there's been a lot of talk about this in the press recently. Um, Appeal to precedent. The Latin term is stare decisis, right? Stand by previous decisions. And so, what happens with in law with an appeal to precedent is that the one of the attorneys will argue, well, Your Honor, in this case, we notice several similarities to a previous case. Don't cite the case, don't name the case. Uh, you should find the same way that the previous judge found because these cases are relevantly similar. You will find arguments from analogy in abundance in philosophy. You'll find them in science, right? So they are indispensable. Why are arguments from analogy so effective, or why are they so important? Because arguments from analogy allow us to explain the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. This is one of the primary ways in which human beings learn new things, right? If you can compare it relevantly to something with which people are already familiar, you got them halfway home, so to speak, right? They have a good idea at that point what you're talking about. So we're going to examine arguments from analogy. And here's an example from the text. Bill is a Democrat, therefore his brother Sam is a Democrat. So arguments from analogy have parts. The first part we need to get familiar with are what are known as the analogs. In this case, Bill and Sam are the analogs. What are the analogs? They are the things being compared. So we're comparing two brothers in this instance, right? Then we have the attribute of interest. The attribute of interest is the characteristic, the relevant characteristic, the one that we are keen to know whether or not the analogs share, right? And in this instance, the attribute of interest is being a Democrat, right? Now, two other relevant parts. The premise analog is Bill because his name appears in the premises, and the conclusion analog is Sam, right? Obviously, because his name appears in the conclusion. Now, remember, chapter 11 is about inductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, we go from particular instances to generalizations, right? Although, again, and this needs to be reiterated, with inductive reasoning, we never have a precision conclusion. We never have a precision answer, right? We're dealing with probabilities, right? And so we are going to assess the strength of these arguments from analogy in terms of relative strength, right? So this argument that's before us right now, Bill is a Democrat, therefore his brother Sam's a Democrat, is relatively weak because we don't have anything to go on beyond the fact that Bill and Sam are brothers, and one of the brothers happens to be a Democrat. So the speaker or writer is surmising that it's more likely that Sam is going to be a Democrat because his brother is. But this is not a particularly strong argument. We just simply don't have enough information to work with to conclude this argument is strong. All right. So how do you evaluate an argument from analogy? Well, there are several factors you're looking for, right? Number one, the more similarities between the premise analog and the conclusion analog, the stronger the argument, right? The more things they have in common, the more similar they are, the more likely it is that they're going to share a relevant characteristic, the attribute of interest, right? And the fewer the similarities, or the more the dissimilarities, the weaker the argument. Two, increasing the number of premise analogs helps strengthen the argument provided the additional analogs are genuinely similar to the conclusion analog, right? So, again, the more that you can find, the more relevant similarities you can find between premise and conclusion analog, the stronger your argument's going to be, the greater the overall probability that they're going to share the attribute of interest. Analogs that lack the attribute of interest are contrary analogs, and the fewer of them among the premise analogs, the stronger the argument. So, let's say you had an argument like Bill is an attorney. His brother Sam is not. Bill went to Ohio State. Sam did not attend college. Bill is a Democrat, therefore Sam is too. That argument would be extremely weak because we have two contrary premise analogs, right? One of the brothers went to college, the other didn't. One is an attorney and the other isn't, right? So that significantly weakens the overall likelihood that they're going to share the attribute of interest. Analogs that lack the attribute of interest are contrary premise analogs, as we just noted. And the fewer of them among the premise analogs, the stronger the argument. If it isn't known whether the conclusion analog has a specific attribute, then diversification among the premise analogs with respect to that attribute strengthens the argument, right? So here's an example. Bill, an attorney, has 4 brothers, including Sam. One of the other 3 sells real estate. Another is an unemployed artist. The third owns a restaurant. These 3 and Bill are all Democrats, so therefore Sam is a Democrat too. So here, right, we don't know what profession Sam is. We don't know what he does, right? The fact that Bill and the other brothers are all Democrats, despite exhibiting a vast or diverse array, of professions, makes it more likely that when it comes to this family, it doesn't make any difference what Sam does professionally. He's still likely to be a Democrat, right? So again, arguments from analogy, get comfortable with them. You are going to see them in numerous places, right? All right, so let's say you're confronted with an argument from analogy, right? Someone, I don't know, because it's election season, someone is trying to encourage you to vote a certain way, and they're trying to convince you that candidate B is relevantly similar to candidate A, a leader from the past that you liked, right? How would you, if you disagree with the argument, undermine it? Well, you would attack the analogy. Attacking the analogy is a time-honored strategy for rebutting an argument from analogy. What it involves is showing that the premise analog or premise analogs are not as similar to the conclusion analog as is implied. And this could involve showing that there are fewer similarities between premise and conclusion analogs, or more dissimilarities, or both. And oftentimes it means calling attention to a single glaring dissimilarity, right? Yes, they're relevantly similar except for this consideration, which is significant, right? And you will recall from chapter 7, we saw there was a fallacy called a weak analogy, right? So again, to give you the classic example of a weak analogy, you were a kid, you wanted to do something, your parents said no, you told your friend, my parents are just like Hitler. Obviously, those whatever alleged similarities there are between your parents and Hitler, they are weak, right? So that's, again, a weak analogy. They are highly debatable. So on Wednesday, we will talk more about arguments from analogy.